Joining me now, we have our partisan panel, former Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin, Democrat, and chair of the state Republican Party, Ben Proto. Ben, Luke, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.
Spoken with both of you a lot of times before. Happy to have both of you on the desk tonight. I want to start off really quickly with reaction. We just saw Senator Murphy's victory speech there, a race that wasn't exactly too exciting. It was leaning more in his favor. But what's your reaction to hearing that tonight?
I think not much of a surprise.
Right.
Matt got in the race late, ran a great race. He's tremendously personable. People really were attracted to Matt and wanted to talk with Matt. It's very difficult to take a two-term United States Senator with $14 million and run a race on low dollars. But he did it. He was all over the state. He was talking to people. He was at every fair, every street fair, knocking doors, something that a lot of statewide candidates don't often do, literally knocking on people's doors and asking for their votes. So I think Matt, can hold his head very high tonight. He did a great job. Very proud of what he did and how he carried the Republican banner. And Matt's not someone who's going to go away.
Yeah. And Luke?
Look, as Ben said, no surprise in this result, but really strong margin. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that Chris Murphy has established himself as one of the most effective United States senators in the country. I mean, you heard it in his remarks, but he was the principal author of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is the most significant piece of gun safety legislation this country's passed in a generation. And he was the lead negotiator on the immigration bill that would have gotten bipartisan support had former President Trump not asked the Republicans in Congress to kill that bill. I think he has shown himself to be somebody who can be extremely effective, not just as a voice for his constituents and for our state, but as a senator in the chamber getting things done. We should be really proud of that as Connecticut residents.
You mentioned some of those big policies. Ben, I want to start with you here, and I want to talk a little bit more about parties. We saw the other race call tonight so far has been Connecticut for current Vice President and Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. We know it's sometimes an uphill battle for candidates in Connecticut for Republican candidates in a majority of races because a lot of these seats have been long held by Democrats. The state GOP is constantly lodging challenges to the state's incumbents, though. What policies would you say, if we're looking at congressional races here, are different and would warrant change in those seats for 2024?
Well, I think we're going to talk about campaigns that are now closed, but clearly the biggest question that the Democrats have never been able to answer is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Vice President had been asked that question a number of times and really is not able to answer it. And I talked to a reporter the other day, and I had someone say to me the other day when we were talking about this very thing, he says, under Donald Trump, I had money left at the end of the month. And under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I have month left at the end of the money. And so I think at the end of the day, when we're looking at these things, we're looking at the fiscal issues, we're looking at the cost of goods, the cost of services, the cost of electricity, the cost of insurance, the cost of childcare, the cost of health care. Those are the issues that I think are driving voters, not only here in Connecticut, but across the country. And I think those are the issues that are going to drive the outcomes of elections across, not only here, but across the country.
We know economy always a big issue for voters. And as I've spoken with people about the state races, obviously they know the cost of living tends to be high in Connecticut. And those, kitchen table economic issues are still really important. Luke, for you, how can especially these Democratic leaders who have held these seats for a long time, how can they talk about making a day-to-day difference for people like your former constituents, here in Hartford? You passed the mayoral torch last year when Ben is saying about people wondering, if they were better off. Yeah. What are some of the things there for you?
Well, look, first of all, I think there's some things that Ben said that I agree with, and there's some things that I don't agree with. Not surprising. What I agree with is that the issues of kitchen table economic pressures, that's on the minds of everybody.
Sure.
I think the idea that Americans were better off 4 years ago at the end of Donald Trump's mishandling of the COVID pandemic is a little silly. And it's important to remember that what the Biden-Harris administration inherited was one of the riskiest times in American history. And what they had to prevent was another Great Depression. They did that. And then we had to contend with inflation, which is now coming down, but there's lots more work to do. Here in Connecticut, what I think we need to focus on are those things we can control at the state level, or at least influence at the state level, and that includes things like the availability of housing opportunity. Across the income spectrum in communities of all kinds, housing costs and housing availability is a real pressure point. Another issue is the affordability of childcare, and I think that coming into this legislative session, I expect that those may be a couple of important issues,
sure.
As well as continuing the progress that the state has made in securing fiscal stability, while at the same time making sure that we're making those investments in communities and in families that make it easier to get by and get ahead.
And before I go to Ben, Luke, I want to follow up with that because I've asked a couple of our representatives this as well. What do you say to constituents and residents who are saying, hey, I saw inflation is cooling, maybe the economy is looking better overall, or as I talked with the comptroller, the state of Connecticut's finances are much better than they were 10 years ago, but people are not feeling those immediate effects. They still see really, really high prices. What do you say to people who are kind of looking at that juxtaposition right now?
Well, again, first of all, I think we have to be honest about what you can control at the state level and what you can't, right? I mean, the state can't really control the price of groceries, right? And you have seen inflation coming down, but as Kamala Harris has said throughout this campaign, lots more work to do. At the state level, I do think some of those issues I just mentioned are areas of focus. Okay. Affordability of childcare, availability of housing, and cost of housing. We can make sure that our state college and university system is both affordable and offering students the paths to opportunity that they need. And I think at the end of the day, we need to make sure that the state continues to grow economically. So we have been on a really strong path as a state, but that doesn't mean we don't have a lot more work to do. It doesn't mean that families aren't feeling that pressure here in Connecticut just as they are across the country. But I think the lesson we need to take away is we're doing things that are moving the needle, but the job is not done yet.
Yeah.
I hope what Americans decide today is that the answer to that is to continue the work, not to go back to what I see as the chaos of what came before it.
And Ben, I do want to talk a little bit more about this because I think a lot of times in the Connecticut state legislature with these state races, we do see a lot of bipartisanship and bipartisan work sometimes, and a lot of times it's an agreement on the issues, but maybe a disagreement on how to get there or what the exact solution would be. So what do you feel like for your candidates are the ways in which they want to see things change that are currently being done right now by Democratic leadership?
Sure. So, when you just had, the comptroller on, Sean Scanlon, talking about the various guardrails that we have in place. Yes. That were put in 2017 in the minority budget that was developed by the Republicans. And it was the first minority budget in the history of the United States to be adopted in a state. And those guardrails were put in. We now have Democrats who want to scale back those guardrails and who want to remove those fiscal protections because there's money there. We want to spend it. We want to spend it. And I think that's one of the bigger issues that we're going to contend with in the next legislative session is how to deal with those fiscal guardrails. To the governor's credit, he has said, no, we're not going to play with the fiscal guardrails. I like those very much. They've done a lot of good things for the Connecticut budget, and we're not going to scale them back or remove them to allow these monies that are coming in to be spent in ways that may not be in the best interest of the state of Connecticut, but may be more partisan or politically motivated. So I think that's going to be the big issue that is really going to be looked at from a fiscal and a budget perspective is what are we doing with the guardrails? Are we going to keep them? And how are we going to deal with the pension situation that we currently have? We're talking about looking at employee and state employees since Ned Lamont's been governor, have received 33% pay raise over 6 years when most of Connecticut are still struggling. When we look at the United Way Alice report that almost 40% of Connecticut households can't pay their bills every month, that's a concern that is going to have to be dealt with. How are we addressing that? And to Luke's point, he's right. The state can't control a lot of what happens because it's a global economy, but there are things the state can do. So when we start imposing mileage tax on trucks that are delivering the food to the stores, that increases cost of groceries. That increases cost of gasoline. That increases cost of other things along those lines. So what are we looking at, and how are we imposing tax structures that are causing prices to increase, that are causing wages to stagnate, that are causing businesses not to create new jobs, which are making it more expensive to build the affordable housing that Luke talks about. So how do you control those things? And I think those are the issues that we're going to have some differences of opinions on and how to deal with.
And Ben, really quickly here, we just have a couple minutes left, but I want to talk a little bit more on a broader scale. This is obviously a presidential election. I mentioned at the top, the state was called for Vice President Harris. We see sometimes with Republican candidates in the state of Connecticut want to distance themselves from former President Donald Trump because he can be a contentious figure. But we know that you've kind of said the party is all in behind him. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and why you're pushing for him tonight?
Sure. I think the reality of the situation is that 4 years of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz will continue to bring the country down financially, will continue to cause hardship for the people in this country on those kitchen table issues that we're talking about. Look, do I think Donald Trump is a guy I want to have dinner with? Probably not. Probably nobody at this table wants to have dinner with Donald Trump, and that's fine. I have no issue with that. But when I look at where we were when Donald Trump was president, and I understand the last year of COVID, and I'm not sure that would have changed regardless of who the president was. It had been Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, or anyone else. That was a lifetime pandemic that we had never seen before. And to Donald Trump's credit during that pandemic, remember Operation Warp Speed, where we developed a vaccine in 6 months that would normally have taken us 10 to 20 years to develop, that was developed within 6 months. So when I look at where we are and where we were and where we want to go, I think the choice is easy. You got Kamala Harris, who's going to continue the Joe Biden failed policies, or we move to a better economic structure.
And Luke, I want to give you a really quick response here.
I appreciate it because there's a lot that I'd like to respond there to. I'm just going to pick and choose a couple of things. First, this point about the state guardrails and Democratic leadership. Let's be clear that under Democratic leadership over the past 5-6 years, the state has made more investments than ever before in our pension system, has built up the rainy day funds, delivered the largest tax cut in the state's history. So nobody can say that Connecticut Democratic Party doesn't have a record of strong fiscal discipline. I think the question we're going to face in the coming months is whether we're getting the balance right when it comes to the investments we're making. The guardrails that Ben talked about this year are projected to save or sort of compel the state to save $1.2 billion, $1.2 billion. At the same time, they may force the state to make cuts to current services that end up increasing costs for families, right? If you're cutting things that result in tuition increases, that make it harder to address the child care affordability challenge, the housing challenges, or reductions to education spending, for example, that then Connecticut residents have to make up for in the form of property tax, you're increasing the tax. So I think what we need to do is have a real honest conversation about the balance that we're striking and whether we're getting it right. And I think the Democratic Party has had a really strong record of showing that it is committed to fiscal discipline, and we also have to have a serious conversation about whether we're making the investments that we need to make. On the point about the national stuff and President Trump, I couldn't disagree more. I think that the risk of going back to the chaos of Donald Trump is a risk not just to our politics, but to our economy. And maybe we can talk more about that later.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I didn't want to cut you off because, as you both know, I love speaking with both of you. We could keep going for the whole rest of the night, but our producers wouldn't be too excited about that. We do want to say, though, as you mentioned, to not go anywhere because we are going to have you back and we are going to be talking more about economic factors, concerns. But first, joining me now in